All right, hello, and welcome to the merrymitch stream and the Three Addict Network. I hope that this stream meets you in good spirits, and that you're ready for a little bit of story time. Uh, let's see, my day's been pretty all right so far. I had a D&D game last night, which was a whole lot of fun. I also want to apologize. There appears to be yard work going on outside of, just on the other side of my wall there. And so this first story may be accompanied by uh, a bit of lawn, leaf blower if it is audible. Hopefully it's not though. Yeah. So I'm excited. We've got a number of stories that I've pulled from Tor.com. Tor.com is a pretty cool website. They throw up a lot of cool works, all for free on their website. So if you enjoy the stories today, it's not sponsored, but feel free to go check out the site yourself. All right, now switching on over, we have a good little goblin holding the log, because our first story is The Log Goblin by Brian Stavely. All right, well, let's pause the jams. And then I thought it might be cool to get some ambience. Let's see, we need something snowy. Don't want the music accompanied though. There we go. That's nice and subtle. So, without further ado, guys, this is The Log Goblin by Brian Stavely. I was a little sad to take down the huge old beech, a wolf tree 3 times as large as anything else around. Most likely, it stood there when the woods were fields, a marker between properties, or just a spot for the cows to graze out of the sun. And it had remained after the farmers left, and the fields gave way to forest once again. It seemed a shame, somehow, to cut it down, but it was dying. And besides, a tree that size was worth more than a cord of firewood. By the next winter, I had it cut, stacked, and dried inside my shed. But it was buried near back, behind 3 other rows, and it wasn't until January that I'd burned enough of the other wood to actually get at it. That's when a strange thing started happening. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I'd go out to the shed in the morning, and the stack of wood would look lower, as though someone had come in the night to steal the logs. It seemed crazy. Who would drive a mile down my rutted driveway in the middle of the night just to make off with an armload of firewood? I told myself I was imagining it. But when you rely on wood to cook your food, to keep you warm, to stop the pipes from freezing, you know how high your pile is, almost down to the last log. And someone, I decided after 3 more days of this, was taking my wood. I caught him the next night. I stayed up late, waiting inside until full dark, then pulling on my coat and boots to go stand guard. It was cold enough that the snow squeaked. The stars were knife sharp. I waited with my hands stuffed in my pockets, shivering and feeling foolish. I was about to head inside when I heard him coming, huffing and cursing and muttering as he made his way up out of the woods, struggling through the deep drifts towards my shed. It was obvious at once that he was a goblin. I'd never seen one, of course. They weren't supposed to be real. But what other creature is greeny brown, pointy-eared, and knobbly fingered, barely taller than my knee? I watched, amazed, as he hopped up on the stack of wood, dragged a single log off the top, and headed off back into the snow, dragging his spoils behind him. I'd never noticed his tracks, but then it had been snowing off and on for days, and the wind had been blowing to beat the band. I'd planned to confront the thief, but instead I found myself following him out into the woods. The moonlight through the pines was bright enough to see by, and it was easy enough to follow the goblin. The log, almost as big as he was, slowed him down. He carried it on his humped little shoulder, mostly. Sometimes it would slip off and drop into the snow. He'd dig it out, kick at it irritably for a while, then pick it up again, forcing his way deeper into the forest. The slashes of shadow and moonlight made everything look strange. I lost my bearings for a while, but when we finally started climbing up a gradual hill, all at once, I knew exactly where we were. And I knew where we were going. There, at the crest of the rise, like a round wooden table poking through the snow, was the stump of the great old beech tree. And there, piled in front of it, was my firewood. Dozens of split logs arranged in some sort of insane scaffolding. I watched from the woods as the goblin entered the small clearing, approached his hoard of firewood, and, with surprising care, placed the fruits of his latest thievery on top. It was an oddly reverential gesture, after all the kicking and cursing. Another night, I might have waited longer, watched more, tried to understand what was happening. Despite, oh, another night, I might have waited longer. Oh, I did read that right. Despite the long walk, however, I was cold and tired, and as the goblin turned away from his pile, heading back for another log, I stepped from the shadows. "Why are you taking my wood?" I asked, somewhat mildly, given that I was the one who had been wronged. He jumped into the air, then bared his crooked little teeth and glared at me. "Your wood? Your wood?" "My wood," I said. "I own this land. I cut down the tree. I bucked it. I hauled it out and split it for the winter. My wood." It was, I thought, an argument that would stand up well in any court of law. But the only judge or jury in that clearing that night was the bright, silent moon, and the goblin just made a sound like a growl in his scrawny throat. "Killing a thing," he declared, "don't make it yours." "It was dying already," I protested. "So are you," he said, stabbing a finger at me.
Doesn't mean I come in your house tonight to chop you down.
I frowned. Suddenly, all turned around by the strange conversation. Are you claiming that the tree is yours?
What I'm claiming is that the tree matters more to them that's buried beneath it than it ever did to you.
I blinked. There's a body,
Two of 'em.
he snapped impatiently.
They courted beneath the beach as kids. Made half their babies here. Said everything that needed saying to each other under these old branches. And they're buried.
He stabbed his stick straight down, gouging at the frozen ground.
Right here. The tree is theirs. Even if it's dead. Even if it's all chopped up. And it ain't your place to go stealing the fire.
But they're dead too, I said, unsettled to discover these unmarked graves in the middle of my land.
And you think the dead don't want to be warm?
He raised the thicket of his brows in disbelief. I stared at him, then shook my head. Why do you care? He looked at me a while, then back to the pile of wood he'd made.
I liked the way she sang
He muttered.
when she was in the fields. She sang even when she was alone. Like she knew I was there. And him,
He nodded at the memory.
when he went out with a bucket for berries, he always left a bush unpicked. For the birds, he said. But I figured he meant me.
Then he was quiet for a long time. Then he was quiet for a long time. We both were, just sitting there like we'd known each other all our lives. Like I hadn't just caught him stealing from my pile. The ground looked so cold. All right, I said finally. I'll help you haul the rest of the wood. It took most of the night, and both of us were wiped when we finished. The pile was pretty haphazard, but it was good wood, that old beech, and it was dry. I only had to light one match, and it went up like kindling. We sat on the stump. It was wide enough to hold the both of us. And we watched the sparks fly up, small as the stars, but hot enough to burn. What were their names? I asked, gazing into the fire.
Leave the names alone.
The goblin snapped. I turned to him, taken aback. I thought I might place a gravestone here, now that the tree is gone.
What do they need the gravestone for?
He gestured with a gnarled hand.
They got a fire.
But a fire, I said, shaking my head. It's so short. He looked at me, then held his twiggy hands out to the flame.
But it's warm.
Shoot, that's a good one. I've read that one only once before. It's still, I think it's grasped my heart the same as last time. Especially that last line. That last string of dialogue. What do they need gravestones for? They've got fire. It's commenting on this idea that uh, gravestones, right? Stone is cold. It's unfeeling almost. It depicts statistically, who was there, who lived from the body that is below. But much like the body below, it's cold and dead. But to this goblin, he believes that it's better that they have something live for a short time than something cold and dead for all time. And man, some of the descriptors in this right here, the stars were knife sharp. It was cold enough that the snow squeaked. These two lines in particular really caught my eye. It was cold enough that the snow squeaked. I can feel that viscerally of the times that I've been, out in the snow. Uh, and it's been cold enough to where, take for instance, like going to the mountains where it is immensely frigid and frozen. Um, when you step with your boots into the snow, it squeaks. But I'd never thought to describe snow like that. Honestly, I'm grateful that I found this because I may utilize these descriptors in my D&D campaign if it comes up naturally. I won't I won't try to shoehorn it in though. I also love this idea that the fact that it's a goblin doesn't make a huge difference. And the fact that there is a goblin in this tale uh, is quite natural, you know? I think that's a tough thing to manage, especially in a short story. To not make a big deal of the fantastic when in in the context of a fantasy world, the fantastic is often mundane. It does take into account that the man who owns the land has never seen a goblin before, and that is strange. But the fact that there is a goblin in the world isn't. Knobbly fingered. Yeah, I'd never seen one, of course. However, it does say, I might need to take back that comment. It does say they weren't supposed to be real, but it's accepted quite quickly by the man, and thus accepted quickly by the reader. I also think it's pretty clever that the goblin and the man weren't named because later on down the line, the goblin mentions, you know, leave the names alone. And these two, after they have that exchange initially, they sit down together and it feels as though they've known each other forever, yet they haven't even mentioned their names. I think there's something to that that relates to that ending of this idea that you can relate to someone and uh, know someone well just by the presence, the warmth. We watch the sparks fly up, small as stars, but hot enough to burn. Stars are actually quite large, though. Believe it or not. All right, well, next up, we have The Red Mother. This is another work of fantasy, I believe. Um, and this one was published in this year, whereas I believe The Log Goblin is from a while back, yeah, 2015. I wanted to intersperse a few new titles along with some of the old ones that I know. Well, thank you, Log Goblin. Trying to think of what the moral of the story is. If we are to take away something from this tale, is it uh I hearkened on the idea of the two that were buried beneath the tree, but the goblin did make a pretty clear and intentional note of not not owning something that you kill. Taking life doesn't make it yours because life is beyond the individual, right? So remember that when we uh when we take uh when we take life, I guess that's the thing to remember. Unless there's a unless there's a goblin around the corner to take back the life that was taken, um, then it's important that we simply remember that the life that we had taken is not ours, and that we hold a respect for it. You know, I'm not sure if that's exactly the moral that it's wanting to come across, but I feel like that's what I believe, and that's what I get from this story. All right. Well, next up will be the Red Mother. Let's see if we can find some good audio to go along with this. Let's see, this would be. What do we have in fantasy? A wandering sorcerer follows his brother's fate, thread into the village of Ormsfjord, where he expects to deliver good news and continue his travels. What he doesn't anticipate is that to meet his brother, he must first contend with the truth at the heart of the volcano that wreaks havoc. What about Lord Keeper Grove? Alright, we'll go with this one. This is The Red Mother by Elizabeth Bear. A pall of ash turned my red horse roan as he and I ambled between tufts of old lava. Basalt fields spread on either side, dotted with burnt, orange or gray-green lichen. Flat flakes of ash drifted past the brim of my hat. Hang on. Perhaps we can find something more volcanic? Question mark? Yeah. Alright, nice. Ahem. A pall of ash turned my red horse roan as he and I ambled between tufts of old lava. Basalt fields spread on either side, dotted with burnt orange or gray-green lichen. Flat flakes of ash drifted past the brim of my hat. We were crossing a big flow near Ormsjord, and the reek of sulfur in the air left both Magni and me over-eager to complete our trip. It couldn't be too much further to the village. Magni's ears were pricked. His walk tended to rush into a tolt. I knew he had scented or heard other livestock that was still too far away for me to detect. He knew that where there were livestock, there was fodder. He was thinking of grain and grass and company, and I couldn't blame him. It had been a long ride, and a lone horse is never comfortable. They're meant to be in the company of their own kind. Some would snipe that this makes my horse the opposite of me. Fair enough. I felt no need for company. I did need supplies, however, and if it were to be had, information to complete my quest. My journey was for kin duty. I had an obligation to find my brother and give him the news that his name was cleared, his honor restored, and his exile ended. To that end, I'd spun the threads of his fate by sorcery and was following them. This was where they led. The first sign of my return to civilization was a graveyard. The road passed through it, flanked on both sides by neat cairns. Some were marked with runestones, some stood uncommemorated. The lichen had grown over a few. The lichen grows slowly, and most of the graves stood barren, sad heaps of brown-black rock, with the sea in the distance behind. Not long after, I came within sight of the village. It wasn't a big village. Ormsjord. It wasn't a big village. Ormsjord. And I was in among it almost as soon as I noticed it. Men and women working outdoors turned to watch me as I rode past the 24 or so houses. Turf houses, some with goats or sheep grazing on roofs that looked more like low hillocks than dwelling places. I'd been corrupted by too much time spent in southern lands, where exotic building materials like wood existed. Any trees that grew here would be for boats and bows and axe shafts and axe hafts, not for houses. A group of men stood around an open-fronted cattle shed, not too far from the well. The baker and blacksmith. They were doing what folk generally do in such circumstances, passing the time of day and pretending to work a little, in case their wives should check in on them. I fingered the ebony and bone spindle in my coat pocket. The thread on it was wound tight, and I was almost to the end of the roving. I'd followed the thread all the way here, woven my path along Arnulf's fate. Arnurl's fate. Arnurl's fate thread. I'd soon need a new thread to follow. It would raise questions for a solitary man to buy carded wool in such a place, however. I rode Magni to the hitching rail, not too far from the cluster of gossipers, but not too close either. There were 5 men, 1 black, 1 red, 1 dun, and 2 as nondescript in color as I had been before my hair and beard went to pewter. They looked up as I swung down from the saddle. Magni stood placidly, except for turning his head to glance over his shoulder, hopeful of a treat. He got a scratch instead and sighed in companionable disappointment when I didn't loosen his girth. You never know when you might need to leave in a hurry. I know, I said under my breath. I'm a grave disappointment to you. I seemed to be a grave disappointment to the cattle shed malingerers as well, judging by the scowls they turned on me. I forced my own face into a friendlier expression than I was feeling, stopped a healthy few paces back and said, I'm looking for a man called Arnulf Ogson, or his wife, Bringirth, Thor's daughter. It's possible they passed this way. Be ye a kinsman? The black-haired one asked. His cheeks were sun-creased above a thicket of beard. I nodded. That sharpened their gazes. One of the nondescript ones asked, Would that make you one they call Hacksliver? I tipped my head to let the question slide off one side. A weight shifted along the broad brim of my hat, but it was just all the ash piled there. We go Viking or we starve. We send our sons off to settle the coasts and rivers of Avalon and the Moonwise Isles. We build our trade towns to send our mercenary bands almost to the heart of the steep. And still, there aren't so many North folk that a man can escape his reputation or a lawsuit with ease. Some sort of sorcerer, I heard, said the black one. Right, said the red. He said he laid warfare on a whole castle full of sentries. A double dozen of 'em, out in Avalon, across the poison sea. Little renown to be won in such work, I remarked conversationally. Who'd sing a man's name for butchering the blinded and limb-bound? Womanish work, spell-weaving, said the black-haired man. Don't they usually keep camp whores for that? He watched me with narrowed eyes. I made myself sound as if I were not disagreeing. A curious tale, From whom did you hear it? My voice gets a little more precise when I'm being not angry. I pulled my hand out of my pocket so I wouldn't finger my spindle, and I didn't place it on the hilt of my knife. There's an old Viking up the Cinder Trail, the red man said. A Carlson, supposed to have been sea king in his youth. Nobody here calls him naught but Half-Hand. A chill lifted the hairs on my neck. Behind me, Magni snorted and shifted, making the saddle creak. I knew a man with half a hand once, a man whose father's name was Carl, a Viking, a sea king, a giver of arm rings. Yes, he had been those things. I said, I never heard of a sorcerer who could lay war fetter on as much as a hand of men all at once. The strain of more would kill the wizard, so they say. The skalds and the seers tell us we ought to love war, and somebody must. There's enough of it. Maybe Ragnar Karlsson, called Hand-Half, called Half-Hand, called Wound Rain, was still that man. Men get old, even sea kings, and I hadn't seen him in 10 years or more, so I couldn't be sure. He certainly wasn't a skald or a seer. I might have passed for a seer, but as for the man who loves war, I didn't think that was me. I was the man who didn't know what else to do with himself if he wasn't fighting a war that he hated. Farming's harder work, and at least as uncertain as raiding, because the world is not a fair place. Farming doesn't win renown. Extorting towns and ransoming priestlings and chieftains, that is where the glory lies. Magni was less than pleased with me when I dusted the ash off his saddle and climbed back on. He'd hoped our walking was over for the day, and there might be hot mash and cool water before long. But after a longing look and a little drunken swerve toward a paddock across the square, populated by half a dozen other horses, he cooperated. Ragnar's homestead was not too much farther. We crossed another finger of the basalt flow and came down into a second grassy valley. From experience, I knew that turf lay over soil no more than a finger length deep, comprised of dust, sand, and loess that had collected in this valley that was little more than a crevice between tufts. Ragnar would have worked himself and his thralls hard to enrich it with dung and fish guts and make it bear the rich green grass that now poked forlornly through the drifts of ash. Cattle would starve this winter if the hay were lost, and if cattle starved, men would starve as well. Viking was an easier way to make a living, until you weakened. Ragnar's homestead was more than a turf house in the village, and less than a sea king's hall. I saw its long shape against the hillside that would have been green with the flush of summer grass. It was built of thatched basalt, not sod and turf, and it seemed to have been built over a stable dug into the slope behind it. The beam over the door was wooden, carved with dragon heads on the ends like a ship's prow. Ragnar was cutting dried turf in the yard, his ropey, scarred back did not suggest that he had weakened. I halted Magni well clear of the gate and whistled. Then dismounted once he turned. He would have heard the hooves, but it was polite to let a man know you were not a raider. As I walked up, leading my gelding, Ragnar's eyes flicked from me to Magni and back again. His face went through a couple dozen expressions before settling on incredulity. "Oh, Silver, you old bastard. Making friends already, I imagine." I shrugged, and in attempting to brush some ash off Magni's flaxen mane, merely ground it in. Ragnar shook his head at me. "I'd wish I'd known you were coming. I would have laid odds that you'd turn folk against yourself in the first half day, and I would have cleaned up. I've never met a man like you for going to a new town and finding somebody who's already mad at you there. It's almost as if you make enemies on purpose." "Some would say that those who spread the tales make the enemies," I answered easily. "A man's earned fame shall never die," Ragnar replied. I snorted loudly enough that I could have blamed it on Magni. It's a comforting thing to tell ourselves that the name lives on, and in my experience, it's nonsense. He continued. "Speaking of death, what are the odds that you're still breathing?" I laid my fingers on my throat. 2-1, I offered. "I'll give you a better spread on it this time tomorrow." "Isn't there some sort of ill-considered decision-making process regarding other people's spouses you could be engaging in right now?" "Hey, your wife came to me, Ragnar." I waggled my hand non-committally. "She wasn't so great, and I think it would be hard to keep her at home if you put in a little effort, though." He cursed like a piked bear, and I wondered if I'd overplayed. I've never had the skill of knowing when to walk away from a flighting. It was safer to take a punch than to look at him. You had to seem like you didn't care, like you didn't fear. Nobody ever won a flighting by seeming a coward. He surprised me, though. He didn't swing. He glowered, and then he said, "What the hell brings you to the ass end of Onjol?" "One thing, and then another." Ragnar's lips worked. "Stay in my hole tonight. Turn your horse in with mine. The wife won't thank me if I let you pass without paying your respects." Does he have a new wife? I wondered. I did learn a few things from the time I spent with Ragnar. One was that if you're going to fuck a man and fuck his wife, it's better for domestic harmony if you make sure everybody involved is on board with the plan right from the beginning. Another was that no one ever got anything out of Ragnar Wound Rain without paying for it, one way or another. I untacked Magni and sent him off to the herd with a pat. Then I knocked the ash off my hat and followed Ragnar up the steps to the door. A quick pause, guys. I'm going to get a sip of water. The fire along the long hearth was banked low, to not overwarm the house in summer. The food was rye bread and ewe's butter, with stewed fish and onions. Ragnar still had the same wife, Erndis, and somehow she'd kept everything from tasting of sulfur and ashfall. I was surprised at how warmly she greeted me. Perhaps Ragnar's irritation was not without bias. I sat at the trestle and washed my hands in the bowl she brought, drank her ale, and bantered with Ragnar while Ragnar's tenant farmers filed in and found their places along the board. There was plenty of food, and Arendis served me again before the Bondi ate. Then she sat at Ragnar's right hand, and a couple of women who might have been wives of the farmers present brought them their bowls and their ale. All three of us were stretching uncomfortably to ease our fullness by the time the tenants were fed and filling back out again for the work of the afternoon. I watched them go, and watched the women clear the table, and thought that there should have been children about, grown and near-grown sons and daughters. I didn't ask after their absence. It might have been that the girls were married into nearby farms. It might have been that the sons were away Vikings, or trading, or a little of both. But in that case, you'd expect a young wife or two carding and spinning and tying off leading strings to keep the babies out of the fire. You'd expect them in silks with silver brooches to hold their to hold their groans up, or even gold like the ones Arendis wore, and not like the wives of the Bondi with their bronze and pewter. It might have been that they'd had ill luck conceiving, or ill luck keeping children alive. But it's hard on any couple my age to run a farm all on their own, even with tenants. Tenants have to be supervised, and thralls have to be driven. Under most circumstances, Ragnar and Erndis would have taken on a few oath sons and oath daughters, to everyone's benefit. They might have elevated the best of their Bondi, or they might have taken in the children of dead companions of the warband. Curiosity might seem insolent, and I take care never to seem insolent unless I mean to. It might cause grief, and that's another response I do not seek to provoke unintentionally. Ragnar had, it seemed, no such bounds on his inquisitiveness. He looked at me rubbing my belly and laughed at me.
So, what are you doing up in the bright country, so far between good meals? Running from a were-guild yourself?
Might be looking for a place to settle, I said noncommittally. My fingertips automatically reached for the spindle in my pocket. I eased them away again. He'd taken me in and given me guest right. I knew, based on our history, that probably meant he wanted something. We hadn't parted on such warm terms that I would expect him to put me out in the ashfall. But farm me out to one of the cottages of his Bondi, maybe. His giving me guest rights in his own home meant he couldn't take a physical poke at me, nor could any of his men. Perhaps it was unkind of me to provoke him with the threat of my continued presence, but kindness has never been a fault that much afflicted me.
Can you buy land?
He asked. I shrugged. Ragnar had to know that I had money unless I'd lost it. and he knew that by preference I diced with fate rather than for silver. My years of Viking had been several, and my needs while traveling were few. A path for my gelding, a mossy rock to lay my head on. I could buy land. It remains to be seen if I want to. It seems you've been spreading a great many rumors about me.
Your rumors spread themselves.
I refrained from provoking him further. It took an effort when he handed me straight lines like that, however. I could just kill you for your money. Oh,
I could just kill you for your money. Your brother being absent, there's no one to pay your weregild to. And it's not as if anyone who knows you would complain.
if I were fool enough to carry my money with me. If I were fool enough to carry my money with me. The money was in bank 20 days' ride south, or 5 by boat if the wind were favorable. If I filled up my saddlebags with gold, Magni would waddle, and it would be bad for his back, and there would be no room for my food. Arendis had always been a quiet one, but clever with it. She gave me a sly look. As I judge from the crumbs in your beard, there's been little enough room for that as there is. Your cooking outshines mine, it's true. Especially when I was cooking up boiled soup cake thickened with shreds of wind-dried fish. Ugh. I found myself reluctant to open the bargaining. When you want something from someone that you can't just take, letting them know it exposes your vulnerability. Still, I had to try. And maybe Ragnar would be feeling generous with a full belly and his ale cup to hand. I said, "You weren't far wrong when you brought up my brother being missing. The real answer to your question of what I'm looking for is Arnjolf. Did you hear my brother was exiled for manslaughter?" Sounded like agreement around a mouthful of rye bread. Ragnar had gotten ropey with age rather than thick, and I couldn't imagine finding a corner in which to fit another bite of anything. But cutting sod is hard work. I glanced toward the hearthstone. The hearthstone, as if fascinated by its ornate, carved and dyed reliefs. The line of Arnfjord's fate led me here. And it ends here. Arendis refilled my cup, while Ragnar wiped ale froth from his beard.
What do you want with him?
I found the real killer. He can go home. Ragnar swallowed, washed it down with ale, and snorted.
Who'd you frame?
You wound me, he said.
In that case, you could have kept your father's farm.
And what about Arnjolf?
Your brother's got his patch of ground by now.
I gestured to his rough hands, the whole one and the one the axe had split. Farming looks like hard work.
I've 100 head of cattle and 7 horses, sheep and goats, chickens and geese and a dog. For Bondi look to me for protection, I even managed to keep nearly all of them alive last winter, which wasn't easy.
He waved vaguely at the doorway, through which the ashy dooryard was just visible. So the eruptions had been going on that long. Perhaps that explained the number of new graves along the road. Not a lot of Vikings this far north.
It's a long swim to civilization,
He agreed.
You really cleared his name.
I nodded, looking back toward my host, away from the fire. Ragnar eyed me levelly. His eyes were light, for such a black-haired man.
So, when you say that someone else was to blame, in all seriousness, factually or conveniently,
I smiled.
and if you can find him and tell him, you're delivered of your kin duty.
Yes. The sun had not set, would not brush the horizon for hours yet. Its rays crept through the vents beneath the roof. It lit the underside of the thatch. It lit the underside of the thatch, and all the things stored in the rafters sideways, creating a bright and alien relief. The interior walls of the longhouse were plastered white with lime render and lime wash to make the interior bright in daylight, painted with coiling trees and flowers in orc reds and yellows. I wondered why they hadn't finished the ceiling under the thatch. Ragnar rattled his fingertips on the trestle.
Why not take the land and farm for yourself? It's an easier living down south than up here in the bright country.
I wasn't lying when I said farming was too much hard work for me. I decided to be generous. So you don't actually have to worry about me buying the next farm over, and my presence weighing on you the rest of your days. Ragnar frowned judiciously.
What's news worth to you?
Curse you, half-hand. This is kin matter.
Sure it is. And so you shouldn't mind running a little errand in return for your news of your brother.
He smirked.
And his wife.
I waited. Ragnar always had known me a little too well. Your word that you know where he is? Ragnar shrugged.
I know where he was and where he was going.
If he'd been lying, I thought, wouldn't he have made a bigger promise? What's the errand?
Let's go outside.
He drained his cup and set it down. I did the same, standing as he stood. I nodded to Arendis, then put my hat on as I followed him into the yard. If Bryngertha had wanted me, I might have been content with the quiet and back-breaking life of a farmer. Might have made myself contented, anyway. But Bryngertha had wanted Arnjorf. And all Arnjorf had ever wanted, in truth, was Bryngertha. And that quiet and back-breaking life. though my brother's experience showed that even the life of a simple land farmer was not without its risks. Ragnar leant on a stone fence and watched his 7 horses and my single one brushing the ash aside to graze. I leant beside him. I waited a long time, watching his expression from the corner of his eye, before I ventured to ask. About that errand. So, Ragnar said by way of answer. I don't suppose you're still a witch. His braids were down to his waist now, befitting a chieftain. If you ignored the bald spot they framed, impressive. He hadn't bothered with a hat. I said. Are you about to claim I ever was one? He snorted.
You were a clever shit anyway. Clever as locked, and just as likely to get snagged on your own pretensions. How are you at volcanoes?
I can ride away from them as well as any man. They say you ought to head upwind and keep the high ground. He pointed at the thread of smoke that rose through the smoky sky. It was just discernible through fumes and falling ash. I could imagine the outline of a conical hill poking above the horizon if I squinted. He said,
What about one with a dragon in it?
There's no such thing as dragons, I said.
Should be easy to slay then.
No, I said, wondering if it was Arnulf's fate, thread that ran out here in the bright country, or Aga Augustin's. Aga Augson's. What kind of naturalist would I be if I went and slew every strange beast I ever came upon? Arendis snickered, which was when I realized she had come out behind us. Women move like a cat. Ragnar glared at her but spoke to me.
So now you're a naturalist.
I'm not a dragon slayer. Arendis spoke in a tone I recognized as the voice of sweet reason. If you slay the dragon, you stop the eruption, I warrant. If you slay the dragon, you stop the eruption, I warrant. He's been digging around in the volcano with his great black claws. There was nary a rumble until he showed up this time last year. We were lucky to get enough hay for winter. And then the sickness came, and a lot of us got the late start on planting this year. There isn't much left. And people are going to be hungry when the dark comes again. Especially with a dragon picking away at the livestock. Folks would be grateful to a man who saved this harvest. Grateful enough to give him a home. And they say dragons hoard gold. Ragnar glared at her. Darling of you to think of my future, sweet Arendis. And to want to keep me around, I said. Ragnar glared at me.
All right,
Ragnar said, when the glare was well out of his system.
Well, getting rid of that dragon is the only way you're getting to your brother.
Arendis suddenly, abruptly, turned and walked away. Too far away to hear us. And then she kept walking. I had seen what her face did before she turned. and a chill lifted my hackles. What do you mean? Ragnar cleared his throat and spat over the rail.
I no fear.
Here. He tapped the earth underfoot with his toe.
Buried. Dead. His wife too. And my daughter. And 2 sons.
I don't.
They came. And they stayed in the winter. And they never left.
Ah. Aga Hacksliver and his famously glib tongue. I was struck as dumb as a stone when the sea washes over it.
Arendis understates this. There was a great sickness.
Ragnar said, taking pity.
It was a hard winter. And the sickness was especially cruel. It fell hardest on the young and those in their prime.
Oh, I said, because it was what I could think to say. I touched the spindle in my pocket, felt the wisp of roving at the end of the thread. Ragnar drew deep breath and shook himself together, turning his bright gaze back to the horses. The horses were calm, and I watched them too. We stood together for a moment. Then he turned and grinned at me, gap-toothed as I stared.
And that dragon, Hacksilver. That dragon's man-long fangs drip venom. Either. So if you want to send your brother home, and his wife, you're going to bring me the gall of that dragon. And you're going to help me get my sons back. And my little girl.
Aithra. There was a word I hadn't heard in a while. A complicated word that could mean anger. Or it could mean poison. Or it could mean gall. In all the sense of gall. The sort that is spoken and the sort that burns flesh less metaphorically. But Aithra was also the source and the font of all life in the world. Life and death are not so far apart as it happens, and neither are venom and the truth.
Have you turned into the cowardly sorcerer they call you then? You'd leave your brother lying in his grave. And bring Gertha beside him, doomed to the Myrgra afterlife allotted those who die of pestilence.
Ragnar was trying to get a rise out of me, and coming perilously close to an insult I could not with honor ignore. But guest rights stood between us. I crossed my arms the other way on the top course of the fence. A few of the horses, including Magni, decided it was a good time to amble over and see if we had carrots. Usually, One doesn't have a lot of options once a man is in the grave. Anyway, people pay more attention to what a man says than to his deeds, and even more than that to whatever lies others tell about him. I pushed a soft, inquisitive horse nose away from my pocket. It's all spin. Maybe I can buy him a better afterlife if I write a few songs about him. Why don't you go and get your own dragon venom?
Most folk are stupid,
Ragnar replied.
and I know the truth behind the stories. At least as far as you're concerned. You've got a better chance of walking into a dragon's lair and back out again than I do. Than any man I've ever met.
Simple. Kill the dragon, collect its gall, raise a bunch of people from the dead, and save the harvest. That's what you want from me.
I'll feed you breakfast first.
Despite myself, when I met his gaze, I found myself smiling at the audacity in his smirk. That audacity is why I sailed with him. It's why I did other things with him, too. I'd think... He rolled his eyes.
Nobody cares what you think. Nobody cares what you think. They only care what you do.
I wished Ragnar to hell in company with my brother. I stared him in the eyes and said, "Your word that everything you've told me is true." Without looking, he flicked his knife from its sheath and across the back of his hand. A thin line of blood formed. The wound rain that was his bynum. We'd spilled enough in each other's company.
My word of honor,
he said. I sighed gustily from the bottom of my lungs. Ash whispered past my forehead, swirling on my breath. I took my hat off and nodded. "Sure," I said. "I'll need some jars with stoppers. And for you to give me your fastest horse. Your fattest horse."
What's wrong with your horse? What's wrong with your horse?
I stroked Magni's neck. He hated having his face touched. "I'm not going to feed my horse to a dragon." Ragnar pursed his lips, making the mustache jut. Then he nodded, reached out, and gave Magni a scratch under his mane.
All right. But if you get eaten, he belongs to me.
We went back inside, and when Erendis brought me more ale, I caught her attention and said, "I have agreed." She brought me seed cake, too. They gave me a sleeping place along the bench, along the wall. Some time before the brief interlude that passed for sunset, we retired. I slept alone, and better than I had any right to in Ragnar Carlson's house. The sun was already high in the sky when we awoke, washed and broke our fast. I followed him outside, still trying to reckon some way to avoid the task he had set me. There wasn't any dragon, I thought. Just the living land heaving beneath us. And there was no god I knew to pray to, and no spell I knew to weave that could so much as delay the eruption of a geyser, let alone make a volcano stop smoking. We'd all be lucky if it didn't decide to send out a tongue of lava to fill up this grassy valley nestled between its previous flows. Ragnar grumbled some more, but he brought me the horse. The dark gelding was fat, all right. He was shaped something like a mango wurzel, and his hooves were overgrown, and he limped in the off hind.
This horse is lame.
Oh, this horse is lame.
You said fattest, not soundest. And you'd not expect me to give you a sound one to feed to a dragon.
It's far to walk. I gestured at the smoking hill on the horizon, and I can't ride him.
Why not? Why not?
Ragnar cackled like a raven that has spotted an old enemy.
It's not like riding him is going to impede his healing. His name is...
Don't tell me his name. I gave the horse a withered piece of carrot. There's no point in getting attached. One sec. Gonna sip some water. Ragnar didn't have a saddle that fit the gelding, round as he was. And I wasn't going to hop on a strange horse bareback and try to get him to take me, all alone, to the den of some monster, or even to a fiery hole in the ground. So I walked and led him. The basalt hurt my feet. The basalt hurt my feet through my boots. It seemed to hurt his feet too, because he minced along like a courtier in heeled shoes. It didn't help that he tripped on his own overlong hooves with every third stride, and limped on that bad leg. Watching him try to move was a sad old comedy. I lured him on with bits of turnip and carrot. He wasn't terribly enthusiastic about the turnip. He grabbed at the carrot, and I knocked on his teeth. Manners. I laughed at myself. Was there any point in civilizing this animal? A sharp bit of basalt stabbed me in the soul, as if my boot leather didn't even exist. I stopped, leant on the gelding's neck, and inspected my foot. No blood. It hadn't gone through, that I could tell. I turned and glared at the horse. He put his nose in my face and blew carrot-scented breath all over me. He had braced himself as if standing on tiptoe. The bad foot cocked off the ground so his weight wasn't resting on it. I ran my hand down the leg. He didn't like me handling it, but there was no swelling, heat, or sign of a fracture. No bulge of a bowed tendon. No sign of a bruise inside the hoof, or any of the other 1,000 things that could go wrong with a horse's foot. Which meant the injury was probably a straightened ligament. a strained ligament, which might heal with a few months of rest, or might be with him for the rest of his life. If he were going to have a life beyond the next few hours, that is. He wasn't badly made, if you didn't mind the hooves and the fat, and the fact that he might have been born dark as night, but the long summer days had weathered him, the same red-black as the crumbling lava underfoot. He was smaller than Magni, but built sturdily enough to carry a grown man. The only marking on him was an ash-fall stippling of white hairs on the flat plane of his face, stretching from brow to muzzle, but not defined enough to be properly called a blaze. He had a pretty head, with defined cheekbones and a tapered muzzle, intelligent ears. I had his full attention as I stood back and looked at him. He nickered at me. I felt a pang for the basalt-colored horse. There probably wasn't a dragon, but if there was a spirit of the volcano, it would want some kind of sacrifice. And if I couldn't trade with a dragon for Etri, to bring my brother and his wife back, maybe I could trade with whatever it was to end the eruption and save the harvest. But one lame horse still probably wouldn't be enough to fix anything. The basalt-colored horse. I'd been going along for such a while without one that the tickle of an idea surprised me. I heard myself whistle. The gelding's ears pricked, and he limped a step towards me. "Don't get your hopes up," I said. "But if you get really lucky, maybe there will be a dragon." He took another step and tripped again. Those feet were a disgrace. Long as a town woman's pattens, and the pony couldn't walk any better in them. I pulled my hook knife from my boot. He looked at me suspiciously. I let him sniff it. He obviously considered it something of a disappointment. "Sorry, boy. It's not a weird carrot." You had to be motivated to get that fat-eating lichen and silage and straw chaff and turnips and wind-dried fish all winter. He had to be motivated to get that fat-eating lichen and silage and straw chaff and turnips and wind-dried fish all winter. Ragnar probably would have slaughtered him for horse meat come the frost. I bent to lift one foot. He leant away from me, worried. Ragnar had never been much of a farrier, and I remembered that most of his horses were afraid of having their feet handled. He apparently hadn't improved. With the aid of carrots and some rye bread sweet with birch syrup, I got the hooves trimmed anyway. He was easier about the last one than the first. He was still lame after, but at least he stopped tripping. The trim made him even more footsore on the basalt. And after watching him mince for 15 or 20 steps, I sighed in disgust, pulled my hook knife out again, and cut a wide strip and a narrow strip off the edge of my oil-leathered cloak. He fussed at me while I tied the crude boots around his ankles, but when he stepped out again, he seemed surprised and pleased at the improvement. I fingered the spindle in my pocket. Damn it, Hack Silver. Don't you go getting attached to your bait. After several more painful hours of walking, the basalt was replaced by a steep slope of cinders. The air stung my lungs, and we both grunted and leant forward, pushing up the slope, cinders crunching. I started to notice the bones. Not complete skeletons or scattered limbs, but here the skull of an ox, there the pelvis of a horse. Big bones, with scraps of meat cured on them by the hot, lifeless air. The horse didn't like the smell. Unease pricked through me, sourceless and unsettling. The horse didn't like the smell. Unease pricked through me, sourceless and unsettling. I was not, as I mentioned, really expecting a dragon. The basalt-colored horse was apparently smarter than me. He stopped halfway up the cindery slope, ears pricked, head craned, neck tense. A steady fellow. He was spooked and snorting, but he stood his ground and inspected the way ahead instead of skittering or trying to bolt. I stopped also, strained every sense, as the horse was straining his. The air reeked of brimstone. My eyes teared. Wreaths of smoke obscured what vision I retained, but as I held myself still, my bones and the soles of my boots were shaken by a low sound. One that seemed to emanate up from the burnt ground underfoot, as much as propagate through the air. It felt like the rumble of a geyser gathering itself to explode. I pulled the spindle from my pocket and inspected the thread wound around it. Gray, scratchy, thin as wire as like to cut you. The measure of a kinsman's life. I'd spun fine to spin long. Long enough for my purpose, maybe. It would have been better woven into a net. A net to catch the vision and imagination. But even the long summer days were not enough. Not long enough for that. So I found a rock about the right height, dusted the ash off it to be certain it wasn't a desiccated pelvis, and sat down. A silver coin from my pocket had already been clipped and shaved a fair bit in its travels. I used my hook knife to shave it a bit more, dulling the edge, but collecting a pinch of silver dust in a fold of my trousers. Silver like mirrors, and silver like tongues. I put the tools down and picked up the spindle, dipped my finger in the silver, drew a loop across my open hand, and gave the spindle a twirl. It dropped, and I rubbed metal dust into the chain ply of my brother's life, making the thread into yarn that could be unwound from the spindle without unraveling. I suppose it didn't matter, really, if the thread unwound itself, assuming Ragnar was telling the truth, and Arnulf and Bryngertha were dead. The poor omen, perhaps, for Arnulf's legend. A poor omen, perhaps, for Arnulf's legend. But Arnulf's legend was the tale of a quiet man, quietly damned for a crime by treachery. There are a lot of sagas about lawsuits. There aren't too many about the losers of lawsuits. Being born again by dragon venom would be the most song-worthy thing that had ever happened to him. Was Ragnar telling the truth? Well, I had known Ragnar to be sly, to misdirect, like any good warlord. I had not known him to betray his word of honor. Getting eaten by a dragon was a death worth singing. Maybe that would be enough of a legend to gain me admittance into one of the better heavens. Or maybe the end storm would blow up while I was flying, and I wouldn't have to worry about legends or kinsmen anymore. Having thought of songs, I sang to myself as I worked, as the ash fell around me. Songs for the goddesses who measured every man's life, and then measured him for his coffin. Songs for the spinners, warlock songs, seether songs, women's songs. But there was no one to hear me except the basalt-colored gelding, and he was in no position to impugn my masculinity. At last, I was out of silver dust, and all the yarn was piled. Gray, scratchy, smelling faintly of lanolin and lye. I stretched it between my fingers and let it twirl out into skein. If there had been any sunlight beneath the ash plume, I might have detected a subtle sparkle in the twist. The basalt-colored horse dozed disconsolately at the end of his lead rope. I'd bored him to sleep. I hoped it wasn't a comment on my singing. I let him sniff the skein, which he did with curiosity, but no apparent concern. That was a relief. Some animals will not abide the smell of sorcery. I started by braiding his mane, working the fate cord into it as I went. I wound the line around his chest and shoulders like a girl binding her wooden horse with thread to make a play harness. He stood for it, remarkably still and even-tempered. I braided traces back on themselves without cutting the line and let them trail, then bound the whole thing off just as I ran to the end of the thread. The horse craned his neck around to watch me, ears alert, eyes bright, an expression dubious. I wished I had a walking stick or a long bone from which to make a whiffle tree, but it would only drag on the ground, and probably spook even this horse. So I just draped the traces over his rump and tied them in a little bow. It was, after all, the symbolism that mattered. Well, buddy, I hope this works, I said. He blew a warm breath over me. He resumed climbing the cone. He blew a warm breath over me. We resumed climbing the cone. The slope leveled as we came close to the top of the volcano. We stopped to drink at a spring that bubbled up from a cluster of stones, clearing some of the ash from our throats. I splashed water on my face. It was lukewarm and fizzled like surf, full of bubbles. It reeked and tasted of brimstone, but at least it wasn't boiling. The horse drank, snorted to clear the fumes from his nostrils, and gave me a look before drinking again, as if to say, "Yeah, I've seen worse." When I lifted my head, I realized we were nearly to the vent. The horse grew increasingly restive, and we came up the final slope. And with a couple furlongs to go, he planted his feet in their ridiculous leather bags and refused to walk another step. I chirruped to him and shook the lead. He planted his hind feet, rocked back and reared. Not a dramatic, sky-pawing rear, but a clear declaration that he was not moving. It was honestly surprising we'd made it this far. "Good lad," I told him, and turned him around to face downhill. I wound the fragile, seeming traces around his head. I wound the fragile seeming traces around a head-sized piece of pumice, and tied them off. Careful not to loop the lead rope around my hand, I stepped up beside the twitching horse and unfastened his halter. I stroked his sweating, ash-gritted shoulder as I slid the straps off his nose. He stood harnessed in sorcery, fate threads, and kin duty, leaning against the yarn-spun traces as if against a plow stopped by thick turf. I stepped away and tossed the halter onto the cinders before turning back uphill. I cupped my hands to my mouth and used a little twist of luck. A scrap of thread wound round my fingers to shift the wind so that my voice would carry. I took the deepest breath I could, tightened my diaphragm, and bellowed.
Here, dragon, dragon! Nice fat pony!
Apologies for the clipping. Turn down the volume.
Here, dragon, dragon! Nice fat pony! Lane 2! An easy dinner!
Again, apologies for the clipping. Thankfully, my limiter probably took care of it, but it probably didn't sound too great. For a long moment, nothing. The reek of fumes swirling on the breeze I'd conjured up. The steam rising from the cinders. The vast silence of the lifeless mountainside. Then came a rumble, and a long, hard clatter like a bag of armor bits and chopped up candelabras dragged over stone. The scraping of stone on stone. I levered my neck back, peering through streaming vapors, blinking away the fume-begotten tears. A great head that only seemed small because it was on a neck as long as a ship's mast poked over the rim of the crater. The head was hammer-shaped and scaled and horned and fanged. I could have called it red or orange in color and not been wrong. But the rough scales seemed translucent and refracted rainbows in their depths, like the planes of light struck within an opal. Even under the dim overcast of smoke and the haze of fumes, it dazzled. The owner of the head and the neck sniffed deeply. Once, twice, then it reared back and struck with surprising speed. I threw myself to the side, cinders bruising my palms. The horse, being nobody's fool, took off. I winced for his bad foot, because I am a soft, womanish fool of a sorcerer. He galloped down the slope with all the alacrity and focus of a horse running hell-bent away from a dragon, the boulder bouncing behind him in its traces. The glamour that I'd spun and sung and nodded around both horse and stone caught on the weave of threads and mirror-bright silver scrapings and made it seem the whole mountainside was collapsing into a vast horseshoe depression. The basalt-colored horse was just one more boulder bouncing along in the midst of the rest. I was rather proud of the effect, and the way the sound of hoofbeats was lost in the simulated rumble of the rockside. I turned my attention back to the dragon as it pulled back and took a long, slow sniff. Red nostrils flared darker in the fire-faceted muzzle. The upper lip drew back to move air across the palate, and a forked tongue flickered. Steam hissed from his nostrils. My vision swam with acrid tears. The head swung down again, falling toward me like the hammer it resembled. If I'd been some hero out of sagas, I'd have swung up my sword, or had a venomed spear at the ready. I just raised my empty hands, as if that could somehow fend off an avalanche. The blow stopped before it fell. The dragon's enormous head so close that the heat off its hide and breath curled my hair. I smelled the ends scorching. The dragon spoke, and despite the shape of tongue and mouth, it surprised me by uttering words I could understand completely. Its phrasing was archaic, its voice as deep and hollow as caverns.
I smell a horse.
It said,
But much closer, I smell a witch. Hello, little witch. That was a clever thing for a wisp such as you.
well, I had been hoping to impress it, and I'd lured it out all right. Now what? It sniffed again.
Have you come to slay a dragon?
A bead of saliva gathered along the edge of the dragon's lip. I stepped to the side as it dripped, stretching a long thread behind it. The venom looked like honey, glowing in the sun. But when it touched the ground, it sizzled on the ash. The spot smoked slightly. I thought about the jars in my pack and felt as cold as if the blood were draining from my body. I gulped down the lump in my throat. I came to bargain with one. You see, I carry no spear, no harpoon. The rumble of the dragon's words shook my diaphragm.
If you wish gold, I will not give it. If you wish ancient and storied weapons, there is nothing you can give me that I could not take. If you wish to die gloriously and be remembered in song, you should have brought a poet. You reek of sorcery.
As long as I don't smell like a snack. It tilted its head to one side.
You smell pickled and strainy.
The wings rustled as it shrugged. Perhaps it was not strange that the dragon's verbal jousting made me feel as if I had come from the wilderness into a safe and familiar hall. I was comfortable in an argument. The fear and tension drained away, and in their place, a manic energy buoyed me. I crouched and held my hand over the smoking Aitre. I turned my face up to the dragon. I was gray with ash and streaked with tears. Oh, man. Okay. Guys, we are about 3 minutes away from time, from the time that I've got today. So I'm thinking that we mark where we are in the story here and return come Sunday. This has been an utter pleasure. It's been quite a while since I've had the inspiration and chance to do a story stream like this one. And I hope that we'll be seeing more of it to come. This is kind of how and where I got my start on Twitch, or how things started up for me. I began by reading Rick Riordan's The Percy Jackson series, and yeah, I like to think that the practice has done me well. I hope you enjoyed the stories today as much as I did. And I hope you'll join me next time to find out what happens to our dear sorcerer as he confronts a dragon face to face. Some incredible stuff, honestly. Let's see, let's pause the ambiance and go ahead and start with the outro. I want to mention real quick that Three Attic Entertainment is the spot today to check out. There's going to be a number of other streamers on the network coming up. There's a whole schedule laid out for a 12-hour stream. And I personally believe that, these streams are pretty exciting and cool because they do have a time limit, Each of us only get 2 hours to perform and do what we can for you. So, go and check it out, even if it's for just a little bit. That is the number 3 and Attic. We're gonna go ahead and raid that channel as well, so you'll be taken right to it. So stick around on the end screen for the raid, and as always, guys, I ask that we all take the merriment that we fostered here today. Let it set you at ease as you go into the rest of your day headlong, and let it carry you into tomorrow. Remember to be good to yourself first so that you might be good to others next. Read books, do good things for your brain and such. And yeah, know that I love you very much. Till next time, guys, enjoy the Three Attic Entertainment. For now, I've been Merry Mitch. Till next time.